During the Canadian Grand Prix weekend, it really felt as though we saw the best and worst of George Russell. On a weekend where the Mercedes W15 out of nowhere decided to be a race-winning car, even though it looked like Lewis had the edge over George throughout practice, when it came down to those all-important last laps, it was George who maximised the car and put it on pole, with Max setting an identical time in the Red Bull. Outstanding qualifying performances is exactly what put Russell on the map in the early part of his career. Although he came into F1 with a huge pedigree, winning the equivalent Formula 3 and Formula 2 championships in back-to-back years alongside Leclerc and Piastri, whilst he was at Williams, he never really had the car to compete on the Sundays. However, during qualifying under the right circumstances, when the field was closer, he made a habit of producing exceptional qualifying performances, which gave him the nickname Mr. Saturday. That is why I don't think it should be a surprise to see George Russell challenging for pole position, because although over the past 2 or 3 years the results haven't really been anything to shout about, which has been mostly down to the car and also a little bit down to him as well, I think people do sometimes forget that George Russell is a very talented driver that's rightly in one of the best teams on the grid, even if he is not one of the most well-rounded of drivers yet. That then takes us into the race, where unfortunately, I also think we saw what I believe to be Russell's 2 biggest weaknesses, which are his tyre management skills and also his propensity for mistakes. In the opening stint, there is no doubt that he didn't look after the inner tyre as well as either Max or especially Lando, but in retrospect, it was his mistakes that really cost him the race. And now, for context, under normal circumstances, I wouldn't blame George for making a mistake, because in such tricky, changeable conditions, we saw the likes of Verstappen, Norris, Hamilton, Alonso and many others all make mistakes and lose time. But the difference with Russell is that he made 3 big mistakes that didn't just lose him time, they all lost him positions as well. On lap 21, when Lando overtook him for the lead at the final corner, he compounded that loss by immediately then running wide and also allowing Max through into P2. This was actually Russell's biggest mistake, because theoretically, had he kept track position over Max and had Lando still lost out due to the timing of the safety car, then there is the very real possibility that George could have just mirrored Max's race on his way to the win. The next big mistake was during the switch from inters to slicks. Max and George pulled the triggers early compared to Lando, and although Lando initially jumped George, he struggled to get his tyres up to temperature fast enough, and so George was able to re-overtake him for P2 on lap 49. At this point over the next 2 laps, Russell was actually the fastest car out on track, catching Max at a rate of almost half a second a lap. It almost looked like we were going to get a chase down fight for the win, but then just 2 laps into his charge, he again made a mistake going wide onto the grass at turn 8 and letting Lando through into P2. When the last safety car came out, Mercedes and Russell decided to relinquish P3 to Piastri in exchange for fresh medium tyres. On lap 63, Russell was only 4 seconds behind Max as he tried a move on Piastri, but once again he made contact when he wasn't far enough ahead going into the final corner, and also lost the place to Hamilton in the process. George would eventually get past Piastri and Hamilton, who had a tyre disadvantage being on the hards, and although a P3 and P4 finish wasn't a total disaster for Mercedes, they definitely had the car this weekend to win the race. When Lewis Hamilton announced his move to Ferrari, I was very interested to see what kind of teammate Toto Wolff would try to go for, because depending on what kind of driver he would choose, it would indicate how much trust he has in George to be a championship contender. If Toto specifically looked at only experienced race winners and even champions, then I think it would have indicated that as highly as Mercedes rate Russell, that he still isn't a sure thing, and bolstering him with a driver who's achieved more perhaps gives Mercedes an even better chance to win the championship, maybe with them and not just Russell. The 2 drivers who fit that mold would be Fernando Alonso and Carlos Sainz, and given that they were both taken off the table, I think it reinforces that the team fully trusts Russell to be not only their team leader, but also their championship caliber driver who, in the right car, is good enough to win a championship up against Max in the Red Bull. In recent weeks, Mercedes' pursuit of 17-year-old Kimi Antonelli for 2025 has reached the next level. There's no doubt that Toto had a hand to play in the FIA reducing the minimum age for rookie drivers in Formula 1, and he also recently admitted to taking Sainz off the table for next year and instead focusing on Antonelli. I think first of all, Carlos deserves a top seat. He has done a fantastic job, but for us, we've embarked on a route now to say, do you know what? We want to reinvent ourselves a bit going forward, and Kimi Antonelli definitely plays a part in that. We haven't taken a decision yet for next year, but we didn't want to have Carlos wait as he needs to take a decision for himself. That's just fair. He's doing a super job. We just want to concentrate on Kimi. That is our future. Young drivers. We want to commit to that, to young drivers, and that is what we told Carlos. And now, despite what Toto said, I still don't think that Carlos can be fully excluded from being Russell's teammate next year. Because if, for whatever reason, Antonelli isn't ready to go straight to Mercedes, or isn't even ready to go to a less pressurized environment like a Williams, in that scenario, Sainz is then surely the obvious and only choice alongside Russell. Either way, the point is that it seems as though Toto does have the trust in George to be their star driver, and that in 2025, it seems that most likely he'll have either Kimi Antonelli as his teammates, or potentially even Carlos Sainz. This will be the first time that George Russell will be the focal point of the Mercedes team, both on and off the track. And now, in terms of performance, since joining Mercedes in 2022, he was always seen as an upgrade on Valtteri Bottas, and so it's no surprise that in the time that the Mercedes duo have been together, they have been by far the closest driver pairing on the grid. The stat that I think highlights this more than any other is their average qualifying gap. In 2022, it was just 0.12 of a second, then 0.02 of a second in 2023, and so far, after 9 races, it's still under 1/10 on average. And now that works out to an average qualifying gap of 0.042 seconds, slightly in Russell's favour over the last 2.5 years. For two teammates to be within less than 0.5 of each other for that period of time is borderline ridiculous. But it does show that on pure pace alone, Russell won't have any problems leading Mercedes when Lewis leaves. What I think will be more of a challenge for Russell is being the outright team leader and also having to seriously clean up his mistakes. Since the ground effect era began, even though performance-wise Lewis and George have been almost equals, Lewis has always been held to a higher standard than George, and he has also been the bigger focal point for the team, especially for criticism. The best example of this is comparing this year to last year. So far, Lewis has come under a lot of criticism for under-delivering, some of which has definitely been warranted. However, when you actually look at the championship, he's only just behind Russell by a margin of just 14 points. Last year, Lewis dominated Russell, finishing third and only behind the two dominant Red Bulls, whilst Russell finished down in 8th. And yet, I actually didn't see a huge amount of criticism from the fans, and especially not from the mainstream media, for Russell's season. And now imagine if that was the other way around, and Russell finished in 3rd and Hamilton finished down in 8th. The level of criticism towards Lewis would have been immense. And the reason for that is because as a 7-time world champion and as the leader of the team, the level of responsibility, scrutiny, and expectations on Lewis's shoulders is something that Russell has never had to experience. In 2025, especially if Antonelli at 18 years old will be his teammate, George will now have to shoulder a bigger level of responsibility. When your teammate is a 7-time world champion, the level of experience that he has is invaluable to the team, especially when they're going through a rough patch like Mercedes have been. Hamilton has always been Mercedes' focal point in the media, who has had to answer the toughest questions when things have gone wrong, and he's also been their reference point on the track due to his success. Equally, it's also what's given Mercedes so much confidence about George, given how competitive he has been alongside Lewis. Or with Antonelli in the other car, Russell will become the only reference point. He'll become the only driver with any level of success or experience for the team to lean on for feedback and also for development direction going into the new regulations in 2026. If things go well, then Russell will enjoy even more praise and even more credit for their success. But if things go badly, then Russell will now also have to shoulder a bigger portion of the blame from the fans and the media, in the same way that Lewis does now. The reason why all of this is important is because when psychologically there's more pressure and more responsibility on you out of the car, it also means that now there is more scrutiny on how you're performing and the mistakes that you're making in the car. And now, even though the spotlight on Russell hasn't been as big as it has been for Lewis, Max, Charles, Lando and Fernando at their respective teams, when you compare the number of mistakes that he has made relative to all of those other drivers under less pressure, if he doesn't clean up his act in 2025, then he is going to start building a reputation as someone who crumbles under pressure and can't be the leader of Mercedes. Even if we ignore his time at Williams and solely focus on his Mercedes years, compared to all of those other top drivers who are already either world champions or seen as potential future world champions that Russell is going to have to beat, he is by far the most prone to crashes and mistakes. Or whether it's misjudgments in wheel-to-wheel combat or concentration errors when big results are on the table, it felt like in Canada we saw the full repertoire of mistakes that Russell makes. It got to the point where even Toto felt the need to come over the team radio to tell George to focus. And not only is that something that we don't generally hear any team principal feel the need to do, but I also don't remember Toto ever feeling the need to do that to Lewis at any point. And now, mistakes and crashes are going to happen in racing, and if you've ever raced competitively at any level, you will know that this is a fact. But the great drivers are always able to rise when they are put under a higher level of pressure, and that, along with being able to do it consistently, is what separates the really good drivers who are able to win races from the great drivers who become champions. When Russell got his first career win in Sao Paulo 22, it was under those pressurized circumstances, so there's no doubt that he can do it. But since then, it just feels like there's been a lack of progression. And when there have been wins on the table like in Singapore last year or Canada this year, even if they have been long shots, there has still been far too many mistakes. Loads of great drivers go through periods similar to this in their careers, including Max and Charles. But the difference with George is that he is now in his 6th season of Formula 1, and it just feels like his mistakes are happening even more frequently. How he goes about solving them I think really depends on why he's making them in the first place. To me it just looks like he always feels the need to push 100% every time and to get the move done there and then. He has got to learn how to build in a bit of margin into his aggressive driving, and even if it costs him 1 or 2 results in the short term, it will make him a more consistent and more confident driver in the long term. When Russell joined Mercedes, he was seen as the future of the team after Lewis. And now I genuinely don't think that either George or Toto expected Lewis to stay at Mercedes for as long as he has, and so it's created this situation where now Toto is openly calling Antonelli the future of Mercedes before Russell has even been able to establish it as his own team. And now George is a very talented driver. We have seen it in his junior career, we saw it at Williams, and we have seen plenty of great moments from him at Mercedes so far. But if he isn't able to refine himself, especially on Sundays, where I think Lewis is still the better overall driver, then it creates the possibility that when Antonelli comes in and naturally improves very quickly, that he might end up superseding Russell in even the next 2 or 3 years, in the same way that Verstappen did against Ricciardo at Red Bull. Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe. That would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.